Hi there. This is a realistic DevOps interview focused on postmortems and building a blameless culture after incidents. These questions are used to understand how you learn from failure, how you work with people under pressure, and whether your teams actually get better after outages. As you listen, pause the video after each question and answer it out loud as if you were in a real interview. Think about how you would respond when emotions are high and accountability matters. If you want more realistic DevOps interview simulations like this, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Warm-up behavioral questions. Tell me about a production incident you were involved in and what the post-mortem process looked like. In one incident, the outage itself was resolved quickly, but the real value came afterward. We held a post-mortem focused on what happened, how the system behaved, and where our assumptions were wrong. We avoided naming individuals and instead mapped decisions, signals, and constraints. The outcome was a clearer understanding of system weaknesses and concrete follow-up actions that actually reduced future incidents. How do you make sure post-mortems lead to real improvements instead of just documentation? I treat post-mortems as a starting point, not the end. Every post-mortem should produce a small number of actionable changes with owners and timelines. I also check back later to confirm those actions were completed. If nothing changes after repeated incidents, that is a signal the process is broken, not the engineers. Have you ever been in a post-mortem that turned blameful? How did you handle it? Yes, and it usually happened when stress was still high. In those situations, I tried to redirect the conversation toward system behavior and decision context. I would ask questions like what information was available at the time or what trade-offs were being made. Shifting focus from outcomes to context often diffuses blame and brings the discussion back to learning. How do you encourage people to speak honestly during postmortems? Psychological safety is critical. I encourage honesty by modeling it myself. I openly talk about my own mistakes and assumptions. I also make sure leadership participates in a way that supports learning, not judgment. When people see that honesty leads to improvement instead of punishment, they open up naturally. What does a healthy, blameless culture look like to you? A healthy, blameless culture does not mean ignoring accountability. It means accountability is focused on improving systems and processes. Engineers feel safe reporting issues early, incidents are discussed openly, and mistakes are treated as learning opportunities. Over time, this leads to fewer incidents and calmer responses when they do happen. Core technical and scenario questions. What is the difference between a blameless post-mortem and no accountability at all? Blameless does not mean careless. It means we hold systems and processes accountable rather than individuals. We still identify decisions that contributed to incidents, but we examine why those decisions made sense at the time. Accountability shows up as system changes, better tooling, and clearer ownership, not punishment. How do you structure a post-mortem so it stays focused and productive? I start with a clear timeline of events to ground everyone in facts. Then I explore contributing factors across people, processes, and technology. I avoid jumping straight to fixes until the full picture is understood. Finally, I define a small set of improvements that address root causes rather than symptoms. An incident was caused by a manual change made under pressure. How do you discuss that in a blameless way? I focus on why a manual change was needed in the first place. Was automation missing? Were runbooks unclear? Was the engineer operating under time pressure or incomplete information? The goal is to understand what conditions made that action reasonable and how to remove those conditions in the future. How do you handle repeated incidents with similar root causes showing up in postmortems? Repeated incidents usually indicate that follow-up actions are not being prioritized. I bring this up explicitly and ask why the underlying issue has not been addressed. Sometimes it is resource constraints, sometimes misaligned incentives. Making the cost of inaction visible helps leadership understand why fixing the root cause matters. What role should leadership play in postmortems? Leadership should create safety and support learning. They should ask thoughtful questions, avoid assigning blame, and help remove organizational obstacles that prevent improvements. When leadership treats postmortems as learning tools rather than performance reviews, the entire culture benefits. If you want to go deeper, the next part focuses on advanced postmortem scenarios and long-term cultural impact. Imagine a major outage where multiple teams were involved and the postmortem turns into several competing narratives. How do you reconcile conflicting accounts and still produce a useful outcome? The first thing I would do is acknowledge that conflicting narratives are normal in complex incidents. People experience different parts of the system and different pressures. I would focus on building a shared timeline using observable facts like logs, metrics, alerts, and deployment records. Once there is a common timeline, I would then layer in perspectives and decision points. Instead of arguing about who was right, the discussion shifts to why different teams saw different signals and how those gaps can be reduced. The goal is not to find the single true story, but to understand how the system looked from multiple angles and how that complexity contributed to the outage. How do you decide how deep a postmortem should go without turning it into a weeks-long investigation? I usually balance depth against impact and frequency. If the incident caused major customer harm or is likely to happen again, it deserves deeper analysis. I start by asking what decisions or assumptions mattered most during the incident. If those are well understood, I stop digging. If not, I go deeper until we can clearly explain why the system behaved the way it did. The mistake is digging everywhere equally. Focused depth on key failure paths gives the best return without burning out the team. In a blameless culture, how do you handle cases of repeated risky behavior by the same individual? This is where blameless culture is often misunderstood. Blameless does not mean ignoring patterns. If the same risky behavior keeps showing up, I look at whether expectations, training, or guardrails are unclear. If those are clear and the behavior continues, that becomes a performance conversation separate from the postmortem. The postmortem stays focused on learning, while people management happens in the appropriate channel. Mixing the two damages trust and makes postmortems unsafe. How do you write action items that actually reduce future incidents instead of adding process overhead? I try to keep action items small, concrete, and tied directly to what failed. Instead of saying improve monitoring, I would say add an alert on a specific signal that would have detected this earlier. Instead of saying improve documentation, I would say update the runbook to include the exact decision that caused confusion. If an action item does not clearly change future behavior or system response, it is probably noise. What trade-offs do you consider when deciding how transparent postmortems should be across the organization? Transparency builds trust and shared learning, but it also requires context. I generally favor broad visibility, especially for technical lessons. However, I am careful with raw transcripts or emotionally charged discussions. I share clear summaries that explain what happened, why it happened, and what changed. This helps other teams learn without misinterpreting partial information or feeling exposed. How do you measure whether a blameless culture is actually working over time? I look for indirect signals rather than metrics alone. Are incidents reported earlier? Do engineers volunteer mistakes without being prompted? Are postmortems shorter and more focused over time? I also look at whether the same classes of incidents are disappearing. A culture is working when learning compounds and responses become calmer, faster, and more predictable. Imagine leadership wants to skip postmortems for smaller incidents to save time. How would you respond? I would agree that not every incident needs a full write-up, but I would push back on skipping learning entirely. For smaller incidents, I suggest lightweight reviews or quick retrospectives. Even 10 minutes of reflection can surface weak signals. Skipping postmortems completely often leads to patterns being missed until they become major outages. The trade-off is time versus risk, and I usually argue that small investments early save much larger costs later. That brings us to the hardest part of this topic, making decisions under pressure, uncertainty, and real organizational constraints. Let us move into some harder situations where there is no clean answer. Imagine a serious outage caused by a manual change that clearly violated an agreed process. Executives are angry and want accountability fast. How do you run a blameless postmortem in that environment? I would separate urgency from analysis. In the moment, leadership usually wants reassurance that the situation is under control and will not repeat. I would acknowledge the process violation without assigning intent or blame and focus on containment and recovery first. When running the postmortem, I would frame the manual change as a symptom, not the root cause. Why was the process bypassed? Was the process too slow, unclear, or poorly enforced? I would be calm and explicit that accountability comes from fixing the system that allowed or encouraged the risky behavior, not from naming and shaming one person. That approach tends to cool emotions and leads to better long-term outcomes. Now imagine a postmortem where a senior engineer becomes defensive and starts shutting down discussion. How do you handle that in real time? I would slow the conversation down and shift the focus back to facts and timelines. Often defensiveness comes from feeling personally attacked. I might say something like, "Let us focus on what the system showed us at this point in time." If needed, I would pause the meeting and follow up one-on-one later. Protecting psychological safety in the room is more important than finishing the postmortem in a single session. If people feel unsafe, learning stops immediately. Here is another scenario. A postmortem identifies several risky architectural decisions, but fixing them is expensive and leadership is not willing to prioritize the work. What do? I would make the risk visible and explicit. I would document the trade-offs clearly, including the likelihood and impact of future incidents. Then I would look for incremental improvements that reduce risk without requiring a full redesign. Sometimes the win is better alerting, better runbooks, or clearer ownership. If leadership still chooses not to act, I make sure that decision is conscious and documented. That way, the organization understands the risk it is accepting rather than being surprised later. Imagine a culture where postmortems are technically blameless, but people quietly avoid risky projects because they fear being associated with failures. How would you address that? This is a subtle but serious problem. I would work on normalizing failure as part of growth by highlighting examples where teams learned and improved after incidents. I would also encourage leaders to publicly support engineers who took reasonable risks. Over time, people need to see that being involved in a failure does not damage their career. Without that signal, blameless language becomes empty and behavior does not change. Last scenario. A major incident happens during a holiday or off hours, and the on-call engineer is exhausted. How do you balance learning with human limits? I would prioritize recovery and rest first. The postmortem does not need to happen immediately. I would capture raw data while it is fresh, but schedule analysis when people are rested. Burned-out engineers produce shallow postmortems and resent the process. Long-term reliability depends on respecting human limits just as much as technical ones. If you made it this far, take a moment and reflect on how you would actually behave in these situations, not how you think you should behave. Postmortems and blameless culture are less about tools and templates and more about judgment under pressure. Which question in this interview felt the hardest to answer honestly? Was it dealing with leadership pressure, repeated mistakes, or balancing accountability with empathy? Drop it in the comments and think through how you would respond in a real incident. If you want more interviews like this that focus on real-world DevOps decision-making, subscribe so you do not miss the next one.